The crate swung loose from the cargo crane at exactly the wrong second, and I was already running before the warning klaxon finished its first shriek. 2,000 pounds of sealed freight, spinning on a snapped magnetic clamp, dropping straight toward the sanitation worker crouched beneath it, with a cleaning unit in her hands, and no idea that death was falling on top of her. I grabbed her by the shoulder and hauled her sideways. We hit the deck together, hard, rolling behind a bulkhead column just as the crate slammed into the floor where she had been kneeling half a second earlier. The impact shook the whole sublevel. Metal screamed against metal. Sparks fountained up from the crushed floor plates. And somewhere overhead, a secondary alarm began to wail. Dust and particulates swirled through the cargo bay lights, turning the air into a haze of glittering debris. For a few seconds we just lay there on the cold deck plating, both breathing too fast, the vibration of the crash still rattling through the floor beneath us. I could feel my pulse hammering in my ears. Then I sat up and looked at the person I had just pulled out of the kill zone. She was Velhari, I could tell, because even with the heavy hood pulled down over her face, and the layered wrappings covering every inch of her skin from throat to ankle, there was a faint glow leaking from the edge of her jaw, where the fabric did not quite seal against her neck. It's a soft, pale light, like moonlight seen through water. The Velhari were famous across the galaxy for that glow. Their skin was semi-translucent, threaded with bioluminescent pathways that shifted color with their emotions. Every species in known space considered them beautiful, the kind of beauty that made other beings stop and stare and forget what they were doing. This one did not want to be seen. That much was obvious from every inch of her. The wrappings covered her from throat to ankle in layers, thick enough to block any light from passing through. Gloves on both hands. Dark fabric stretched tight over her fingers. Hood so deep I could barely see the lower half of her face, just a sliver of jaw and the curve of a mouth pressed into a thin, tight line. And the moment she realized I was still holding her shoulder, she flinched away from me so hard, she nearly cracked her head against the column behind her. I let go immediately. Raised both hands, palms out. Easy. No threat here. Just a dock worker who did not want to watch someone get crushed. She scrambled to her feet without looking at me, checked that her wrappings were intact, with quick, practiced hands running over every seam and edge, and then walked away. Did not say thank you. Did not say anything at all. Just walked straight back toward the sanitation bay with her head down and her shoulders locked tight, as if being saved from a falling crate was somehow less frightening than being touched by a stranger. I watched her go, and felt something settle in my chest. Not concern exactly. Something closer to recognition. I had seen that kind of movement before, that controlled, deliberate smallness, that way of navigating the world as if the goal was not to get somewhere, but to pass through without being noticed. I had seen it in shelters back on Earth, in the faces of people who had learned that visibility was dangerous. My name is Declan Hale. I had been working as a cargo logistics coordinator on Frontier Station Aurelia for 11 months at that point, long enough to know every face on the dock crew and half the faces on the levels above. Aurelia was not a pretty station. It sat on the ragged edge of explored space, a waypoint for traders and haulers and refugees, and people who had reasons to keep the core systems at arm's length. The hull was patched in 6 places. The artificial gravity hiccuped every 3rd day at 4 in the morning. The food was engineered for nutrition rather than pleasure, and the corridors smelled like recycled air and industrial coolant. But the work was honest. The pay showed up on time, and the company was the kind you found on any frontier. A patchwork of species all trying to get by without stepping on each other too much. I had never seen this Velhari before. I checked with my shift supervisor that evening and learned her name was Vera. No family name listed. No homeworld on file. She had arrived 3 days ago on a refugee transport from the mid-rim sectors, processed through intake with a Category 4 refugee designation, which meant she had come with nothing. No possessions, no contacts, no resources. Category 4 refugees got assigned the lowest available work tier, and on Aurelia, the lowest available work tier was sanitation, cleaning cargo bays, scrubbing coolant stains from corridor floors, the kind of work that kept you underground and invisible. The kind that nobody wanted to do, and nobody respected the people who did it. Over the next 2 weeks, I made a point of crossing her path, Not aggressively, not obviously. I knew better than to crowd someone who flinched from casual contact. But I would route my cargo checks through her section of the sublevel, walking a little slower than necessary, past her cleaning station. I left a ration pack on the ledge near her equipment locker where she would find it after I had already moved on. Always the same kind, always sealed. Never with a note or anything that might feel like an obligation. I asked her small questions, the sort that had easy answers and required no personal disclosure. Was the freight lift on Corridor 7 running properly? Had the ventilation been acting up in Section 4? Professional questions, safe questions. Questions that gave her a reason to respond without requiring her to reveal anything about herself. At first, she barely responded. A nod. A single word delivered to the floor, rather than to my face. She kept her eyes down whenever anyone was within 10 meters of her, and she positioned herself with walls at her back whenever the space allowed it. She ate alone, always in the same corner of the sanitation bay, hunched over her food with her body curled around it, as if at any moment someone might reach across and take it from her hands. She worked her shifts in complete silence and vanished the moment the duty chime sounded, disappearing into the lower corridors like smoke dissipating into recycled air. But she did not move away from me when I stood near her. That was the first thing I noticed, and I noticed it because it stood in such sharp contrast to how she treated everyone else on the sublevel. The other workers gave her a wide berth, and she seemed to expect it, but when I stood at the cargo console next to her cleaning station, running manifests and muttering to myself about mislabeled freight, she stayed. She did not edge away. She did not redirect her route. She tolerated my presence in a way that felt, if not comfortable, at least not actively threatened. After a few days, her single-word answers stretched to 2 words, then a full sentence. Then, one shift when I made a genuinely terrible joke about the ventilation system breaking down for the 4th time that cycle, and how at this point, I was pretty sure the station was trying to suffocate us all on purpose. I caught something that made me stop mid-sentence. A flash of pale blue light pulsed across the visible strip of skin at her jaw. Quick, involuntary, gone almost before I registered it, like a firefly blinking in the dark. A Velhari laugh. I did not know that at the time. I learned it later. From the xenobiology references, I would eventually spend my nights reading, but I saw it in that moment. That quick shimmer of living blue, alive, and startlingly warm against the drab gray of the cargo bay. And then it vanished as she pulled her hood tighter and turned away from me with a sharp, almost panicked motion. Something about that moment lodged in my chest and stayed there, not because of what I had seen, but because of how fast she had hidden it, as if laughing was something she could not afford, as if a moment of genuine amusement was dangerous, a crack in a wall she needed intact to survive. We settled into a routine after that. She would be cleaning, I would be running manifests. We would exchange a few words, sometimes a few sentences, always about work, always about safe and impersonal things. It was not friendship, not exactly, but it was a rhythm, and I could feel her relaxing into it by fractions over the days and weeks, the way a wild animal learns to tolerate the presence of someone who never reaches for it too quickly, who never makes sudden moves, who shows up consistently and asks for nothing. It lasted 3 weeks before the thing happened that broke the pattern open. I was moving a loaded pallet near the secondary freight bay, guiding it onto the staging platform while the hoverlift stabilizer fought with a persistent calibration error. Vera was nearby, cleaning the floor drains along the far wall. The stabilizer failed. The pallet tilted hard to the right, 300 kilograms of crated equipment sliding toward the edge, and Vera was directly in the drop path. I reacted on instinct, the same instinct that had fired 3 weeks ago with the crane crate. I lunged, grabbed her arm, and pulled her clear. But this time, when I gripped her forearm, the fabric of her wrapping caught on the edge of a cargo bracket and pulled. Her sleeve rode up, just a few inches, just for a heartbeat before she ripped her arm away from me with a force that sent her stumbling backward into the wall. But I saw it. Her skin beneath the wrapping was not glowing. It was dead, flat, matte gray, the color of cold ash, utterly devoid of the luminescence that should have been there. And carved into that dead skin, in precise geometric patterns, were scars. Not accidental scars, not the marks of an injury or a workplace burn. These were deliberate, symmetrical, patterned with the kind of precision that only came from tools designed for the purpose. Lines and angles, and repeated motifs, branded into her flesh with mechanical consistency. She stood frozen for a moment with her back against the wall, her eyes locked on the exposed strip of forearm, her whole body vibrating with something that went far beyond fear into a territory I did not have a word for. Her remaining luminescence, the faint glow at her jaw and neck, went completely dark. Every light in her skin went out at once, like someone had thrown a switch. Then she pulled the sleeve down with both hands, pressing the fabric flat against her arm, sealing it, hiding it, and she looked up at me with an expression that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. It was the face of someone who had just been caught, not doing something wrong, being something wrong. The face of someone whose worst secret, the thing they had built their entire existence around concealing, had just been seen by the one person they had started to trust. And in a voice so small it nearly vanished beneath the hum of the cargo bay ventilation, she whispered, "Please don't look." I stepped back. I let go of every part of her space. I did not chase. I did not press. I said, I didn't see anything. And I meant it as a gift, as the only thing I could give her in that moment. And then I turned around and walked to the other end of the cargo bay and stood there, with my hands gripping the edge of a console, until my knuckles turned white and my arms shook. But I had seen it, and I knew what those marks meant. Not the specifics, not yet. But I had grown up on Earth. I had studied history. I had walked through the museums and the memorials, and the places where humanity kept its darkest records, so that no one could pretend they did not exist. I recognized the geometry of systematic cruelty when I saw it. Those were slave brands, and the woman I had been sharing quiet, careful moments with for 3 weeks was carrying them under every inch of fabric on her body. I did not sleep that night. I sat in my quarters with the lights off and stared at the opposite wall, and thought about the way she had said please. Not angry, not defensive, not demanding. Just a small, fractured word, offered like the last coin from an empty pocket. Please don't look. I was not built to look away. No human is, not really. We pretend we are. We tell ourselves we can mind our own business, stay in our lane, keep our heads down. But something in the wiring of our species makes that impossible when it counts. When we see suffering, real suffering, the kind that has been carved into someone's skin and hidden under layers of fabric and silence, something in us locks on and will not let go. The next morning, before my shift, I sat down at my personal terminal and started searching. I started with the Velhari species index in the Galactic database. What I found was equal parts beautiful and devastating. The Velhari were a relatively rare species, fewer than 800 million individuals spread across known space. They originated from a water world called Velar Prime, a planet of deep oceans and bioluminescent reefs, where entire ecosystems communicated through light. Their skin was not merely decorative. The luminescent pathways threaded through their bodies were directly connected to their neurological and emotional processing centers. The light was not something they produced, it was something they were. Joy pulsed blue, grief flickered in shades of gray-violet, anger burned red at the edges. Love, according to the xenobiology texts, manifested as a deep and sustained gold that could last for hours. To a Velhari, the light was identity. It was selfhood made visible, the inner world projected outward in colors that could not lie. And to other species across the galaxy, it was mesmerizing. There were entire art forms built around watching Velhari emotional displays. Their performances were sought after in the wealthy core systems. Their presence at diplomatic functions was considered a mark of refinement and cultural depth. That beauty was exactly what had made them targets. I found the reports buried 3 layers deep in the Galactic Law Enforcement Archives, filed under trade violations and economic disruption, rather than under what they actually were. The Corvin Syndicate, a sprawling criminal commercial network operating across the outer territories with financial tendrils reaching deep into the core, had been trafficking Velhari for decades. Not for labor, not for domestic service, for their light. Velhari bioluminescence could be extracted, refined, concentrated into a compound the black market called shimmer. a luxury narcotic that produced a state of euphoria so pure and so intense that a single dose sold for more than most beings earned in a full year. It was the most expensive substance in the outer territories, and the demand never decreased because the clientele were the kind of people who had enough money to never worry about the cost of anything. The extraction process was exactly as horrible as anything I could have imagined, and worse than most of it. The syndicate's harvesters burned channels into living Velhari skin using precision thermal tools, severing the bio-neural pathways that produced bioluminescence, and then siphoned the luminescent compounds directly from the exposed tissue. The brands I had seen on Vera's arm were not just ownership marks. They were harvest maps. Each geometric scar marked a site where someone had cut into her and drained the light out of her body, where a piece of who she was had been extracted, processed, packaged, and sold to someone who wanted to feel beautiful for an evening. The harvesters kept their subjects conscious during the process. I read that sentence 3 times. They kept them awake because fear and pain caused the Velhari nervous system to flood the bioluminescent pathways with heightened compounds, and the shimmer extracted under those conditions was more potent, more valuable, more sought after, by the kind of clientele who could afford to pay premium prices for premium suffering. I closed the terminal. I sat very still for a long time. Then I opened it again, because closing my eyes did not make the words disappear, and because I owed it to Vera to understand the full scope of what had happened to her before I decided what to do about it. What I found next was somehow even worse. In Velhari culture, the loss of luminescence was not treated as an injury. It was treated as spiritual death. The light was the soul made visible, and a damaged soul was not something to be healed or mourned. It was something to be cast out. A Velhari whose bioluminescence had been significantly compromised, whether through illness or accident, or the kind of deliberate violence that the syndicate practiced, was considered hollow, corrupted, spiritually contaminated. The Velhari word for such a person translated roughly as husk, an empty shell, a body without the essential element that made it a person. Vera had not merely escaped captivity. She had escaped into a universe that had already decided she was broken on a level that could never be repaired. Her own people would not take her back. Other species who understood Velhari cultural norms treated her with the same quiet revulsion. She was alive, technically free, and completely alone. Every society that knew what the marks on her body meant had concluded that she was less than whole, and their conclusion was not cruelty in their minds. It was fact, spiritual fact. The kind of truth that did not require justification because everyone agreed on it. No wonder she hid. No wonder she wrapped herself in layers of fabric every morning, and flinched from touch, and ate alone in corners. She was not merely protecting herself from being seen, she was protecting herself from the judgment that inevitably followed being seen. Because every time someone looked, they confirmed the thing she feared most, that she was exactly what they said she was. Empty. Husk. Gone. I closed the terminal for the second time and pressed my palms against my closed eyes until spots of color bloomed behind my eyelids. I thought about Vera working her sanitation shift at that very moment, 20 meters below where I sat, wrapped in her armor of dark fabric, trying to be invisible in a galaxy that had already decided she did not count. And I thought about a species called humanity that had spent 10,000 years doing terrible things to each other and had somehow, through all of it, never lost the capacity to look at suffering and say no, not here, not while I am standing. When I went down to start my cargo shift that morning, I did not say anything about what I had learned. I did not bring up the incident with the sleeve. I walked to my console, said good morning, and asked her if the freight lifts were working properly today. She gave me a 2-word answer, and I caught the faintest, almost imperceptible relaxation in her shoulders, the kind of micro-movement that told me she had been bracing for a very different kind of conversation. I gave her the same normal I had been giving her every day for 3 weeks, but underneath it, in the part of me that was still sitting in a dark room reading about harvest maps and conscious extraction, and a word that meant empty shell, everything had changed. Because now every time she flinched, I knew why. Every time she pressed herself against a wall, I understood what she was guarding. Every time she pulled her hood lower over her face, I could see the math of what had been stolen from her, and the equation was monstrous. 3 days after I read those reports, The Drenari merchants came through Aurelia on a routine trade stop. There were 4 of them, tall and angular, with the oversized compound eyes that gave their species exceptional spectral vision. They could perceive wavelengths far beyond the human visible range, penetrating through thin materials the way our eyes could see through clear glass, including, as I was about to learn, the ability to see through fabric to the luminescent patterns of Velhari skin beneath, or in Vera's case, to the absence of those patterns. We were in a corridor on level 7, heading back from the supply depot. Vera was walking beside me, which was itself a small miracle I did not take for granted, and the Drenari were coming the other direction. The lead merchant slowed as it passed us, its massive compound eyes fixed on Vera with an intensity that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I watched it scan her, watched its gaze track across her body beneath the wrappings, reading what its spectral vision revealed underneath. The map of dead zones, the harvest scars, the empty spaces where light should have lived. It said something in Galactic Common, loudly, deliberately. The word was Keloth Vaughn, and I did not know the translation yet, but I felt Vera go rigid beside me. Every muscle locked. The ambient glow I had grown accustomed to detecting at the edges of her hood went completely dark, and her breathing shortened to quick, shallow gasps she was trying to keep silent. The other 3 Drenari laughed, a quick, dismissive sound. One of them made a comment in Galactic Common that I later translated as something close to, "They should not permit the hollow ones to occupy shared spaces. It offends the senses." Another one clicked its mandibles in agreement. Vera started to turn away. That practiced pivot, that silent, well-rehearsed retreat, the movement of someone who had been absorbing blows like this for years, swallowing them, packing them down into whatever place she kept the things that hurt too much to hold. I stepped in front of the Drenari. I did not raise my voice. I did not clench my fists. I did not do anything that could be interpreted as a threat by station security cameras. I just moved, placing my body between them and her, and I looked at the lead merchant with the kind of eye contact that among humans communicates something very specific and very clear. "Walk away," I said. "Now." The Drenari blinked at me with those enormous compound eyes. It tilted its head sideways, the gesture that indicated confusion among its species. "We were merely observing a factual condition," it said, its voice carrying the particular condescension that some galactic species reserved for humans. "The Velhari is damaged. This is not opinion, human. It is observable reality. Among species that comprehend such nuances, the observation is culturally appropriate and carries no malice." "I do not care what it carries among your species," I said. "Among mine, you just insulted a member of my crew, so you have 2 options. You can apologize to her, or you can walk away. What you cannot do is stand here and pretend that cruelty is observation." They chose to walk, muttering about human oversensitivity, about how humans had been part of galactic civilization for barely a century and already acted as if they owned every corridor they walked through, about how some species understood the natural order of things, and some species needed another few hundred years of evolution before they would catch up. I watched them go. My jaw was tight, and my heartbeat was elevated, and there was a low, steady hum of anger running through me that had nothing to do with the Drenari specifically, and everything to do with the system they were a part of. A galaxy that looked at a woman who had survived something unspeakable and treated her scars as contamination rather than evidence of what she had endured. I turned back to Vera. Her luminescence was still dark. Her hands were trembling at her sides, but she was looking at me directly, not at the floor, and for the first time in the weeks I had known her, she held my gaze. "You do not understand what I am," she said. "I know exactly what you are," I said. "You are my colleague. You are on my crew, and nobody talks to my people like that. Not while I am standing here." She stared at me for a long time. I could not read her expression with any precision. I did not know enough about Velhari physiology or emotional signaling to decode what was happening behind those large, dark eyes, but when we walked back toward the cargo bay, she walked beside me instead of behind me, close enough that her shoulder was a hand's width from my arm, and the faintest ghost of pale blue light pulsed once at the edge of her jaw. Then again, then settled into a soft, steady glow that lasted almost a full minute before she tamped it down. That was the beginning of everything that followed. Though I did not fully understand it then, that moment in a grimy corridor on level 7 was the crack in the wall. Not just the wall Vera had built around herself. The wall the galaxy had built around people like her. Because one human refused to let a stranger be treated as less than a person, and that refusal turned out to be the kind of fracture that, once started, cannot be stopped. The next 2 weeks were a fragile, careful thing. Vera did not suddenly open up. She did not pour out her story or collapse into my arms, or do any of the dramatic things that stories would have you believe happen when someone shows a broken person a moment of genuine kindness. What actually happened was slower, and more real, and more difficult than any story could capture. She stopped pulling her hood down reflexively when I approached. She started saying my name, Declan, in her soft, precise pronunciation, turning the syllables over as if testing whether the word was safe to hold in her mouth. She began eating lunch in the same section of the cargo bay where I took mine, not beside me, not across from me, but in the middle distance between isolation and proximity. I did not push. I did not press. I did not ask questions about what I had seen on her arm, or what the Drenari had said, or why she wrapped herself in so many layers. I had been raised by a woman who taught me that the most important thing you could offer another human being, or any being, was the space to come to you on their own terms, and in their own time. I applied that lesson every single day, with a discipline that sometimes felt like holding my breath underwater, because every night, I went back to my quarters and read more about the syndicate and the shimmer trade, and the things that happened in those facilities, and every morning, I came back down to the cargo bay and acted normal while carrying the weight of everything I knew. Then the coolant line ruptured on sublevel 9, and choice was stripped from both of us. It happened at shift change, the busiest moment of the work cycle, when maximum bodies occupied minimum space. A corroded junction in the ceiling of the secondary maintenance corridor gave way without warning, and a spray of industrial coolant came down like chemical rain. The compound was classified as non-toxic to most carbon-based species, but it was highly corrosive to organic fabric, standard textiles, uniforms, wrappings, anything made from the composite materials used in station-issue clothing. It dissolved them on contact within minutes. The fabric softened, went translucent, then disintegrated into fibrous paste. I was caught in the edge of the spray. My outer uniform layer started breaking down immediately, going soft and threadbare across my shoulders and arms. Standard emergency protocol engaged automatically. Decontamination showers on level 9. Strip down, rinse the chemical residue, put on fresh coveralls. I had been through it twice before. Everyone on the sublevel began moving toward the showers, peeling off ruined clothing as they went, grumbling about the inconvenience. Everyone except Vera. I found her in the far corner of the maintenance corridor, pressed into the junction between two walls, both hands clutching the disintegrating fabric at her chest. The coolant had soaked through her wrappings completely. I could see the material degrading in real time, layer after layer going translucent, thinning, beginning to separate. The chemical was working its way inward toward her skin, and where it had already penetrated, I could see redness blooming. Irritation. The beginning of a chemical burn. She was shaking. Not from cold and not from pain. From something that lived deeper than either of those. She was shaking from the knowledge that the fabric dissolving off her body was the only thing standing between her and everything she had spent years hiding, and in a matter of minutes, it would be gone. She could not go to the decontamination showers. The showers meant stripping down in a shared space. Stripping down meant every scar, every brand, every dead patch of lightless skin would be visible under the harsh fluorescent lights of a public decon bay. Every person in that room would see exactly what she was and exactly what had been done to her, and the judgment would follow as surely as gravity. The whispers, the revulsion, the cultural conclusions that would spread through the station within hours. Husk, hollow, contaminated. She would rather let the coolant eat into her skin than face that. I moved fast, went to the primary decon bay, told every worker inside that the unit was malfunctioning, and they needed to use the secondary station on level 8. A lie delivered with enough urgency that nobody questioned it. Within 3 minutes, I had cleared the corridor. Empty. Silent. Just me and Vera, and the steady drip of coolant from the ruptured pipe above. I went back to her. The fabric across her left shoulder had completely dissolved, exposing the skin underneath, and the chemical residue was turning it an angry, inflamed red. She needed the shower. Every second she waited increased the damage. "The bay is empty," I said. "I cleared everyone out. I will stand guard at the door. My back will be turned. Nobody comes through. You have my word." She looked at me. Her breathing was fast and uneven. The faint glow at the edges of her remaining luminescence was cycling rapidly through colors I could not identify. A Velhari stress response that looked like panic, rendered in light, flashing and strobing in patterns that had no stability. Then her breathing slowed. Something settled in her expression. A decision, arriving after 7 years of hiding, in the worst possible moment, under the worst possible conditions, because sometimes that is how the important decisions come. Not in peace, in crisis. "No," she said. Her voice cracked and she swallowed and tried again. "No. I am tired. I am so tired of hiding from you, Declan. You are the first person in 7 years who has looked at me as if I am real, who has stood between me and the things that hurt without asking me to explain why I needed the protection. If you are going to see, if you are ever going to see, then let it be now, all of it. And when you have seen, you can decide whether you still want to stand next to me at the cargo console tomorrow morning." She reached up with both hands and pulled the remnants of her hood away from her face, then the wrappings at her shoulders, then the layers across her torso, peeling them away like someone removing bandages from a wound that has been covered for far too long. She let it all fall. I looked. She had asked me to look, and I owed her the courage of seeing what she had found the courage to show. So I looked. My heart did not break. Breaking implies something clean, a snap, a fracture along a natural fault line. What happened to my heart was messier than that. It came apart. It crumbled. It disintegrated the way the fabric on her body had disintegrated, layer by layer, until there was nothing left between me and the raw, exposed truth of what had been done to this woman. Her body was a map of atrocity, from her collarbones to her wrists, across her shoulders and down her ribs, and along the planes of her back. The brand scars covered her in methodical rows. Dozens of them. Hundreds. Geometric patterns burned into skin that had gone permanently dead, permanently dark. The bioluminescent pathways beneath them severed and cauterized and drained of everything that had once made them shine. Each scar was a harvest site. Each geometric mark was a location where someone with a precision tool had cut into her, opened a channel, connected a siphon, and extracted the light from her living body while she lay conscious on a table, feeling every second of it. The dead gray patches covered approximately 70% of her skin. The remaining 30% still glowed, faintly, stubbornly, isolated islands of pale luminescence surrounded by vast continents of scarred silence. Those surviving patches pulsed with dim, unsteady light, as if the remaining pathways were straining to produce what the damaged majority no longer could, flickering like candles in a room full of extinguished lamps. Between the brand marks, other scars told other parts of the story. Restraint burns circled her wrists, her ankles, her neck, thin grooves where bindings had cut into her skin, over and over across years, until the tissue scarred permanently into ridged channels. And on her left shoulder blade, larger and more precise than any of the harvest marks, was a registration glyph, a serial number, KV4471, branded into her when she was, as she would tell me in the next few minutes, 11 galactic standard cycles old. A child. They had done this to a child. I did not speak for a long time. When I finally found my voice, it came out sounding like it belonged to someone else. Someone older. Someone who had just aged a decade in the space between one breath and the next. "How old were you?" She was watching my face with an intensity that burned through the air between us, searching for the thing she had always found before. The flinch, the revulsion, the moment when the person looking at her stopped seeing a woman and started seeing a thing, a damaged thing, a thing to be pitied, or feared, or avoided. 11 cycles, she said. I was taken from a refugee transport near the Velar border. My mother was with me. They took us both. I was in the facility for 6 cycles. They freed me when I was 17. A patrol ship raided the station where we were held. Your mother, I said. She did not survive the facility. Vera said it in a flat, precise tone that communicated more grief than any amount of tears could have expressed. Her light went out entirely in the 4th cycle. When a Velhari's light goes out completely, the neural cascade that follows is fatal. It takes approximately 48 hours. I was in the cell next to hers. I sat down on the floor of the maintenance corridor. I did not decide to sit. My legs simply refused to support the weight of what I was hearing, and I ended up on the cold metal deck with my back against the wall, and the coolant residue stinging my own skin, and none of it mattering at all. Vera told me about the facility. Not in a flood, not in a rush, in pieces, carefully selected, placed before me one at a time, like someone laying out the fragments of something that shattered long ago. She told me about the harvesting table and the restraints that held her body immobile while the tools cut channels into her skin. She told me about how the harvesters worked methodically, section by section, burning precise geometric patterns, because the patterns allowed for maximum extraction efficiency while keeping the subject viable for future harvests. She told me about how they kept every Velhari in the facility conscious throughout the process, because terror and agony flooded the bioneural pathways with intensified compounds, and the shimmer extracted under those conditions was more potent and more valuable. She told me about the other Velhari in the holding cells, the ones who had been harvested so many times that their surviving patches of light grew smaller and dimmer with each session, the ones whose light eventually guttered out entirely, and who were removed from the cells and not returned. She told me about the silence that followed each disappearance, how the remaining captives would go dark, their luminescence dimming in unison, a shared grief expressed in the only language they had left. She told me about being freed, the patrol ship, the raid, the doors opening, and then the part that no one wanted to hear about, the part that came after liberation, which was its own kind of darkness, the medical evaluations that catalogued her injuries without meeting her eyes, the refugee processing centers, where the workers were kind but distant, efficient but unreachable, the other Velhari at the rehabilitation facility, who looked at her scars and turned away, because in their culture, she was not a survivor. She was contaminated, hollow, a walking reminder of something too terrible to acknowledge. She told me about the years of hiding, the wrappings she put on every morning like armor, the jobs she took at the bottom of every station's hierarchy, because the bottom was where no one looked. The slow, grinding erosion of believing, day after day, year after year, that the galaxy was right about her, that she was exactly what they said, empty, husk, a shell with nothing left inside. I am telling you this, she said, and her voice was shaking but her eyes were steady, because you pulled me out from under a falling crate on my first day and did not ask me to thank you. Because you left food near my station and pretended it was not yours. Because you stood between me and 4 Drenari and called me your crew without hesitation, without knowing what I was, without understanding why they said what they said. No one has ever been angry for me before, Declan. They have been disgusted. They have been uncomfortable. They have been politely horrified from a safe distance. But no one has looked at what was done to me and felt rage. I looked up at her from where I sat on the floor. The coolant residue was burning my arms, and I did not care. My eyes were stinging from something that was not chemical, and I did not try to hide it. I need you to hear something, I said, and I need you to hear it from a human, because my species has a particular and painful history with this specific subject, and we have earned the right to say what I am about to say. Where I come from, on Earth, we have a word for people who survive what you survived. We do not call them husks. We do not call them corrupted, or contaminated, or hollow. We call them survivors. And the marks they carry on their bodies, we call those proof. Proof that something tried to destroy them. Proof that it failed. Vera's remaining luminescence shifted. The scattered islands of living light across her body pulsed once, slowly, then again, then settled into a color I had never seen from her before. It was not the blue of laughter, or the dark gray violet of grief, or the white of fear. It was something between gold and pale amber, warm and tentative, flickering at the edges like a candle flame in a gentle draft. It pulsed along the borders of her scars, outlining them in soft light, as if the living parts of her skin were reaching toward the dead parts, trying to bridge the gaps. "That color," she said quietly, looking down at her own arms with an expression that was equal parts wonder and disbelief. "I have not made that color in a very long time. I thought I could not make it anymore." She did not tell me what it meant. Not right then. But later that week, the station medic, a human woman named Hannah Price, pulled me aside in the mess hall and told me she had been monitoring Vera's bioluminescent readings as part of a routine medical baseline. The output from Vera's surviving pathways had increased by 11% over the past month. Velhari luminescence is directly responsive to emotional environment, Hannah said. In hostile or threatening conditions, the pathways dim as a protective response. She paused and gave me a look that was part professional curiosity and part something more personal. "What exactly did you do, Declan?" "Nothing," I said. "I just refused to look away." The weeks after the reveal were different. The wall was down between Vera and me, and the space it left behind was tender and new and required careful navigation. She still wore her wrappings in the public corridors. She still kept her hood up when passing through areas with heavy foot traffic. But during our cargo shifts, when the bay was quiet, and it was just the two of us, and the hum of freight machines, she pushed the hood back. Let the light at her jaw and cheeks show freely. And the glow was noticeably stronger now than it had been when I first met her, as if the surviving parts of her were compensating for what had been taken, burning brighter in the absence of the 90% that could no longer burn at all. She talked more, about Velar Prime, which she barely remembered, about the bioluminescent reefs beneath its oceans, where her species had evolved. Vast underwater forests of living light, where thousands of Velhari moved together through the deep water, and their combined luminescence created patterns so complex and so beautiful, they were considered a form of communal language. She had never seen those reefs. She had been taken too young, but her mother had described them to her, during the quiet hours between harvesting sessions, in the holding cell they shared, weaving pictures out of words and memory, to give her daughter something that could not be extracted. Something else was happening during this time, something I did not plan or organize or request. The other humans on Aurelia were taking notice. There were 19 of us scattered across the station's various departments, and we had never been a particularly unified group. Just individuals doing our jobs in the same place, connected by species rather than purpose. But information traveled through our small human population with a speed and efficiency that would have impressed any communications officer. I never told anyone about Vera's scars or her past. I did not need to. Humans are pattern recognizers and gap fillers by nature. They saw me walking alongside a hooded Velhari, who flinched from everyone except me. They heard about the Drenari confrontation. They drew their conclusions. Hannah Price began making extra visits to Sublevel 9 with medical supplies calibrated for Velhari physiology, dermal treatments and neural pathway supplements that she sourced through channels I chose not to ask about. Connor Walsh from the engineering department quietly recalibrated the environmental controls in Vera's work section, raising the humidity and ambient temperature to match the subtropical conditions of Velar Prime's surface regions. Lucy Grant from station security adjusted her patrol routes to pass through the lower cargo bays with a frequency that was far too consistent to be coincidence. Nobody coordinated any of it. Nobody called a meeting or formed a committee or drafted a plan. It was just a thing that happened, the way gravity happens, the way tides happen, the way humans close ranks around someone in need without being asked, without expecting acknowledgement, without requiring the person they are protecting to understand or reciprocate or even notice. Vera noticed before I did. One shift, she paused in the middle of cleaning a floor drain and looked around the cargo bay at the various humans who had somehow found reasons to be in her general vicinity. Connor was checking a junction box that did not need checking. Hannah was conducting an air quality test that she had already conducted yesterday. A mess hall worker named Grace Elliott was delivering supplies to a storage locker that was already fully stocked. "Your people keep appearing," Vera said, and there was a tone in her voice I had never heard before. Bewilderment layered over something deeper and more fragile. "I have not asked for them." "You have not asked for them. They come without reason. Why do they come?" I thought about it for a moment. The honest answer was complicated, rooted in evolutionary biology and social psychology and 10,000 years of human behavioral history. But the true answer was simpler than all of that. "Because they saw you," I said. She considered this. The light at her jaw pulsed slowly, cycling through colors I was gradually learning to read. "Other species see me and leave," she said. "We are not other species." That conversation happened on a Tuesday. On Wednesday morning, a Corvan trade vessel docked at Frontier Station Aurelia, under standard commercial credentials, and the fragile piece we had built shattered like glass under a hammer. I was halfway through my shift when the docking alert sounded through the sub-level speakers. Corvan frequency signature, commercial class vessel. Nothing in the automated manifest scan triggered the security filters. But the moment that particular frequency tone echoed through the cargo bay, Vera stopped moving. Not the flinch I knew, not the startle and recover. Something deeper and more complete. A total shutdown. Every trace of light drained from her skin, until she was uniformly gray, and her eyes fixed on the middle distance with the absolute stillness of prey that has just scented its predator. "They are here for me," she said. No question in her voice. No uncertainty. Just flat, terrible knowledge. I pulled up the docking records on my console. The vessel was registered to a company called Telvon Resource Solutions, which was a subsidiary of a holding company called Outer Reach Consolidated, which was, according to the research I had spent weeks conducting, a documented front for the Corvan Syndicate. They had not come flying pirate flags or broadcasting threats. They had come wearing corporate credentials, carrying trade licenses, docking through proper channels. And that made them infinitely more dangerous than any raider fleet, because raiders operated outside the law and could be fought with weapons. These people operated within the law and could only be fought with other laws. Within 6 hours of docking, a Corvan named Dreth Vasek presented himself at the office of Aurelia's station administrator. He was polished, impeccably dressed, calm in the way that very expensive professionals are calm, the composure of someone backed by an organization with more resources than most planetary governments. He carried a sealed data case, and inside that case was a document that dropped through my chest like a stone through water. A legal recovery claim. Under the Outer Territories Commerce Accord, the document stated, "The Velhari female designated by registration glyph KV4471, currently residing on Frontier Station Aurelia, under refugee classification, was categorized as absconded bonded labor. Telvon Resource Solutions, operating as the authorized agent of the original contract holder, was exercising its lawful right of recovery." The filing included certified title of ownership, registration glyph, biometric verification, a genetic match confirmation, and a formal extradition request processed through 3 separate layers of galactic trade bureaucracy, each one stamped and countersigned and annotated with jurisdictional references. Every document was in order. Every seal was authentic. Every legal reference checked out. The syndicate had not come to take Vera by force. They had come to take her by paperwork. And the paperwork was flawless. The station administrator was a Thessian named Commandant Ureth. She summoned me to her office that afternoon, and when I walked through the door, I could see immediately that she was caught between 2 enormous pressures, and neither one was going to release her without damage. She was sympathetic. I could read it in the careful way she folded her 4 hands together on the polished surface of her desk, in the deliberate neutrality of her voice when she delivered the words I already knew were coming. "The recovery claim is legally valid under the jurisdictional framework that governs this station's operations," she said. "I have the authority to delay enforcement by requesting additional documentation verification, but I do not have the authority to refuse a lawful recovery claim without demonstrable legal cause. Under the Commerce Accord, the Velhari individual is classified as contracted bonded labor, and the contract holder's designated agent has standing to recover. She was 11 years old when they took her. I said. My voice was very even, because I was holding it even with every gram of self-control I possessed. She did not sign a contract. She was branded with a serial number and harvested for 6 years. I understand your position, Mr. Hale. I am sympathetic to it. But I am telling you that under the legal framework governing this station, your position does not constitute recognized cause for refusal of a lawful claim. She paused. Something shifted in her expression, a crack in the administrative composure that told me she was not merely delivering bad news, but hating every word of it. I am granting you 72 hours before the formal recovery hearing. I strongly suggest you use them. I walked out of that office with a fury so cold and so controlled that it felt like a different state of matter. Not fire. Ice. The kind of focused, crystallized anger that does not shout or break things, or waste energy on display. It simply calculates. 72 hours. 3 days to find a way to stop a machine that had been grinding people into product for decades without consequence. I went straight to the cargo bay on sublevel 9, and when I arrived, I discovered something that stopped me in the doorway. Every human on Aurelia was already there. 19 people. Standing in a loose semicircle near the entrance to Vera's work section, Lucy Grant had intercepted the recovery claim through the security database. Hannah Price had been alerted when Vera's biometric file was accessed by the legal filing. Connor Walsh had flagged the Corvan frequency signature and run the same corporate genealogy I had traced weeks ago. The information had propagated through our population the way a signal propagates through a circuit, fast and clean and unstoppable. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Lucy Grant said, "What do we need?" I looked at them, cargo handlers and medics and engineers and security officers, and food service workers and maintenance technicians. 19 humans on a frontier station at the edge of nowhere. Not soldiers, not diplomats, not lawyers. Just people who had seen what needed to be done and had shown up without being asked. Because showing up is what humans do when the situation matters enough. I need time, I said. And I need the Syndicate's people to never be alone with her. Not for a single second. Not in any corridor, not in any bay, not in any part of this station. They nodded, and they dispersed into the station like water finding its level, each one moving to a position they had somehow already identified as critical. And within the hour, a rotation was in place. Humans at every junction between the Corvan docking berth and the lower decks. Humans in corridors and mess halls and maintenance access points. Not armed, not aggressive, just present. A network of quiet, immovable refusal, constructed from 19 ordinary people who had collectively decided, without discussion, without vote, that some things mattered more than jurisdictional law. I spent the next 50 hours working 3 fronts simultaneously, sleeping in fragments when my body demanded it, eating when someone pushed food into my hands, running on the kind of focused, narrowed energy that humans produce when they are protecting something they cannot afford to lose. The legal front. I filed a counterclaim under the Human Coalition's Universal Personhood Statutes, a set of laws that Earth's government had championed during its first decade as a galactic political entity. The statutes declared that any sapient being within human-administered space, or under the declared protection of a human citizen, was legally recognized as a person under coalition law, with all attendant rights, regardless of any other species or territory's legal classifications. The statutes had been designed for exactly this kind of situation. The problem was that Aurelia was not human-administered space. The statutes had never been tested outside Earth's direct jurisdiction. But filing the claim created a procedural conflict between coalition law and the Commerce Accord, and under galactic administrative procedure, jurisdictional conflicts required formal resolution before enforcement of the underlying claim could proceed. It was not a solution. It was a wedge jammed into the gears of a machine that was trying to crush someone I cared about. The diplomatic front. Lucy Grant transmitted a full situation brief to the nearest human coalition outpost, 4 days away at standard transit speed. She included everything. The recovery claim, Vera's documented history, the counterfiling, the syndicate's corporate structure. The response came back in 40 minutes, which was far too fast to have originated from an outpost 4 days away. It came from Coalition Central Command. On Earth. A single line. Acknowledged. Stand by for directive. The speed of that reply told me something critical. Someone in the Coalition's senior leadership had been waiting for this kind of test case. Someone with authority had just looked at a frontier station at the edge of nowhere and decided that this was where the line would be drawn. The human front. This was not strategy in any conventional sense. This was stubbornness made manifest, the kind of deeply human refusal that does not require planning because it runs on something more fundamental than plans. Our 19 maintained their positions with a quiet, implacable consistency that seemed to genuinely confuse the Corvin delegation. They were not accustomed to resistance that looked this calm. Syndicates understood threats. They understood negotiations. They understood the language of power and leverage and mutual interest. What they did not understand was 19 people who had nothing to gain and nothing to negotiate, who simply stood in corridors and doorways and nodded politely and did not move. Dreth Vasek attempted to access Sub-Level 9 on the second day. He walked down the primary corridor with his 2 legal specialists in tow and found Connor Walsh performing an unscheduled systems diagnostic on the corridor's main access hatch. Tools spread across the floor, panels open, the kind of maintenance operation that could plausibly take anywhere from 30 minutes to 3 days depending on what was found. Vasek waited. Connor worked. 20 minutes passed. Vasek tried a secondary corridor and encountered Hannah Price conducting a medical environmental assessment with a sensor array and a clipboard, documenting air quality readings at each intersection with the meticulous thoroughness of someone who intended to check every cubic meter of atmosphere on the entire level. He doubled back to try a maintenance shaft and found Grace Elliott restocking an emergency supply cabinet that was already fully stocked, humming softly to herself as she reorganized the contents for the 3rd time. He requested that station security escort him directly to the Velhari subject's registered location, and Lucy Grant informed him, with perfect bureaucratic courtesy and a smile that never reached her eyes, that the area in question was currently under temporary access restriction, pending the completion of a safety review initiated by the engineering department. She offered to put his request in the queue. Vasek was intelligent enough not to push overtly, but on the evening of the 2nd day, he found me in the station's commercial district and approached with the smooth, reasonable demeanor of a professional who was accustomed to resolving situations through negotiation. "I understand human attachment," he said. "It is perhaps your species' most documented characteristic. But attachment does not alter legal reality, Mr. Hale. The Velhari represents a significant capital investment for my clients. Recovery operations are expensive and disruptive. Perhaps we can resolve this in a manner that satisfies all parties. A compensation arrangement, perhaps. Name a figure." I looked at him for a long, quiet moment. Then I said, "She is not for sale. Not to you, not to your clients, not at any price, not ever." His expression did not change, but something behind his eyes recalculated. The professional mask remained perfectly in place, but I could see the machinery adjusting behind it, reassessing the situation, recategorizing me from obstacle to threat. "You are making an error," he said. "The law supports our position. Sentiment, however admirable, does not override contractual standing." "We will see," I said. And I walked away from him with the kind of deliberate calm that communicated something no words could have delivered. The hearing convened at the 72-hour mark in Aurelia's Central Operations Hall. Commandant Urith presided from the administrative platform. Station security lined the walls. Dreth Vasek arrived with 2 Corvin legal specialists carrying data tablets loaded with precedent and a sealed evidence case containing the original ownership documentation. He was prepared. He was thorough. And by every metric of the legal framework that governed this sector of space, he was right. I arrived with Vera. She walked into the operations hall without her hood, without her gloves, without the layered wrappings she had hidden behind for 7 years. She walked in barefoot, wearing a simple station-issue shirt with short sleeves, and every scar on her body was visible to every being in the room. The brand marks covered her in geometric rows, harvest channels carved through skin that should have glowed with the living light of everything she felt. The dead gray patches, matte and silent, covering 70% of her body. the surviving islands of faint luminescence, pulsing weakly between the scars. The restraint burns at her wrists and throat, and the registration glyph on her shoulder blade, KV4471, the number they gave an 11-year-old girl when they decided she was inventory. The hall went silent, not the polite silence of a formal proceeding. The heavy, weighted silence of a room full of beings confronted with something they could not look away from and did not know how to process. I did not argue trade law. I was not a lawyer. I did not have the training or the precedent library or the jurisdictional expertise to defeat the syndicate's legal team on their own ground, and attempting to do so would have been a losing game played by their rules. Instead, I asked Vera to speak. She stepped forward. Her luminescence was dim but visible, the surviving patches flickering with the kind of unsteady light that comes from tremendous effort, and she spoke in clear, precise galactic common, and she did not perform, and she did not plead, and she did not cry. She described the facility, the harvesting table, the tools, the restraints, the way the harvesters calibrated their instruments between sessions, discussing extraction yields and purity metrics in the same tone a farmer might discuss crop rotation. She described the holding cells and the other Velhari inside them, and the way the light dimmed across the entire cell block when someone was taken and did not return. She described her mother's light going out over the course of 48 hours in the adjacent cell, while Vera pressed her hands against the partition and watched the last flicker of gold fade to gray and then to nothing. She described being freed, the patrol ship raid, the open doors, and then the silence that followed. The medical assessments that never asked what happened in the cells. The rehabilitation center, where the Velhari counselors looked at her scars and looked away. The processing queue. The refugee classification. The sanitation assignments on stations where nobody remembered her name. She spoke for 14 minutes. When she finished, the operations hall was so quiet, I could hear the ventilation cycling 3 levels above us. I turned to Commandant Urith. "You have a legal question in front of you," I said. "Is this woman property, or is she a person? I am not going to argue trade law with the syndicate. They will win that argument, because they have better lawyers and more money, and an entire system designed to ensure they win. I am not going to play their game. Instead, I am going to tell you what happens next." I let the silence hold for a beat. "If you rule that she is property, every human on this station walks off their post today. Not tomorrow, today. And every human vessel that transits this sector will know that Frontier Station Aurelia handed a torture survivor back to the organization that tortured her, because the paperwork was properly filed. Humans do not forget things like that, Commandant. We build monuments to make sure we never forget, and we do not forgive them." Vasek stood. His composure was intact, but I could hear the edge beneath it now. "This is emotional coercion," he said. "The Commerce Accord is clear and unambiguous. Emotional appeals do not supersede contractual standing. The recovery claim is valid. The biometric match is confirmed. The jurisdictional framework supports enforcement. The documentation you are holding describes a child being branded and harvested for 6 years," I said. "You can call it a contract. You can call it bonded labor. You can file it under whatever category makes your clients sleep comfortably at night. But every person in this room knows what it is, and no amount of paperwork changes it." Then Lucy Grant's communicator chimed. She pulled it from her belt. "Read the message on the screen." Her face went very still. She looked up at Commandant Urith. "Permission to read an incoming directive from the Human Coalition Central Authority, Commandant." Urith nodded. Lucy read it aloud. "The Human Coalition, acting under the full authority of the Universal Personhood Statutes, Article 7, Section 3, had formally designated the Velhari individual, known as Vera, as a protected person under Coalition jurisdiction, effective immediately and without expiration. Any station, territory, governing body, or commercial entity that surrendered her custody to any party claiming ownership, contractual standing, or recovery rights would be subject to immediate and comprehensive economic and diplomatic sanctions from the Coalition. All human shipping, trade infrastructure, logistical support, and transit authorization through the affected sector would be suspended pending full resolution. The directive was signed by the Coalition's Secretary General and countersigned by the chairs of 3 parliamentary committees. The legal ground beneath HFY shifted, not by inches, by continents. Aurelia's entire commercial operation depended on human shipping lanes. Human freight comprised 62% of the station's trade volume. Human transit routes connected Aurelia to 7 major commercial hubs. The Outer Territories Commerce Accord did not contain enforcement provisions capable of countering the economic leverage of a major galactic power. The mathematics of the situation, which had been tilted entirely in the syndicate's favor for 72 hours, reversed in the space of 40 seconds. Commandant Ureth sat very still for a long time. She looked at the syndicate's legal team and their data tablets full of precedent. She looked at Vera, standing in the center of the hall with her scars visible and her remaining light pulsing faintly. She looked at me. Then she ruled. Vera was granted protected person status and indefinite asylum under Human Coalition jurisdictional authority. The recovery claim was denied. HFY and the crew of the Telvon Resource Solutions vessel were instructed to undock from Frontier Station Aurelia within 6 standard hours. Vasic gathered his data case. He rose from his seat. His legal specialists fell in behind him. As he passed me on his way toward the exit, he stopped. The professional mask was gone now. What was underneath was not fury, though there was fury in it. It was something closer to incomprehension, the expression of someone who has run every calculation, checked every variable, and still cannot understand how the numbers came out wrong. All of this, he said quietly, all of this for one damaged Velhari. I looked at him. That is your problem, I said. You keep seeing damaged. I just see her. He left. The Corvan vessel undocked 4 hours later and transitioned out of the sector without transmitting a single word. In the days and weeks that followed, the ripple spread outward from Frontier Station Aurelia in every direction, faster and farther than anyone on the station could have anticipated. The Coalition's invocation of universal personhood outside human-administered space became the single largest diplomatic flashpoint in galactic politics that quarter. News feeds across the core systems carried the story. Not the story of Declan Hale or the 19 humans on a Frontier station, because that was not the story that mattered. The story that mattered was Vera, the story of a child taken at 11 and branded and harvested, and then freed into a galaxy that treated her survival as contamination. The story of a system that had classified that child as inventory and then built legal scaffolding so elaborate and so sturdy that the classification had stood unchallenged for decades. Other species began asking the kinds of questions that the Outer Territories Commerce Accord had been specifically architected to prevent. Delegates from the Thessian Collective demanded access to syndicate facility records. The Rithani Parliament introduced a resolution calling for an independent audit of all bonded labor contracts involving sapient bioluminescent species. Even the Drenari Commerce Guild, whose members had laughed at Vera in a corridor on level 7, issued a statement acknowledging that cultural practices regarding compromised Velhari may warrant re-evaluation. The statement was tepid and carefully worded, and it was still more than anyone had ever gotten from the Drenari on the subject. The Corvan government, which had quietly tolerated and financially benefited from the syndicate's operations for decades, found itself facing the kind of sustained, public scrutiny that could not be deflected with jurisdictional technicalities or buried in subcommittee hearings. 3 additional galactic powers followed the Coalition's lead within the month, enacting their own sapient being protection statutes modeled on the human framework. A joint enforcement task force was formally proposed, with initial funding committed by 7 member states. 2 syndicate facilities in the Outer Territories were raided within the first 60 days. 43 Velhari were recovered. The images from those raids, the harvesting tables and the restraint rigs, and the extraction equipment laid out in clean, clinical rows, went across every major galactic network and could not be unseen. None of this happened because of me. I need to be clear about that. It happened because a species that had spent a century being told it was too emotional for galactic politics, too sentimental, too irrationally attached to abstract principles about dignity and personhood, looked at a woman covered in scars and said no, not here, not under any law, not ever. And it turned out that those abstract principles had teeth. On Aurelia, Vera stopped hiding. not all at once. The first week after the hearing, she pushed her hood back during shifts and left it down. The second week, she stopped wearing the gloves, and I watched her hands move freely for the first time, gesturing when she spoke, resting openly on surfaces, instead of clenching inside dark fabric. By the end of the third week, she walked the station's corridors in a standard uniform with short sleeves, her arms bare, the brand marks visible to anyone who passed her. The first time she did it, I walked beside her, and I could feel the effort it cost her in the tension radiating from her shoulders, the careful control of her breathing, the way she held her chin, just slightly higher than was natural, as if physically refusing to drop her head. By the second time, the tension had decreased by half. By the fifth time, she walked those corridors the way anyone walks a corridor, like a person going somewhere, like someone who belonged. Most species still looked away when they saw the scars. Some stared and then caught themselves and redirected their attention. The Drenari avoided her section of the station entirely, which suited everyone involved. But the humans on Aurelia looked at her, not staring, not studying, not cataloging her damage with the clinical distance of a medical scan, just seeing her. A nod in the corridor from Connor Walsh, a greeting in the mess hall from Grace Elliott, a smile from Hannah Price that carried no pity and no performance, just the simple warmth of one person acknowledging another, the ordinary, unremarkable, world-changing act of treating someone like a person. And then something happened that Hannah Price said should not have been scientifically possible. She called me into the medical bay on a quiet afternoon, 5 weeks after the hearing. Vera was sitting on the examination table, and she was looking down at her own left arm with an expression I had never seen on any face of any species. It was wonder, pure, uncomplicated wonder. The kind that belongs to children seeing something miraculous for the first time. I looked at her arm, and I understood. At the edges of the dead zones on her skin, the borders where scarred gray met surviving tissue, there was new light, faint, uneven, patterned in ways that did not match any healthy Velhari bioluminescent map that existed in the medical databases. New pathways were forming. Not restoring the original network, Hannah explained. The original bio-neural junctions had been cauterized during harvesting. That damage was permanent. But new pathways, entirely new neural connections, were threading their way through the damaged tissue, growing around the scars the way tree roots grow through cracked stone, finding roots that had not existed before. This is not documented in any Velhari medical literature I have access to, Hannah said. Her voice had the careful, measured quality of a scientist confronting data that contradicts established theory. The harvesting process is considered neurally terminal for the affected pathways. Regrowth has never been observed. She paused. The closest hypothesis I can construct is that Velhari bioluminescence is significantly more adaptive than current understanding suggests. If the emotional environment changes radically enough, the underlying neural substrate may be capable of forming entirely new pathway architectures, not restoring the old ones, creating new ones that never existed before. Vera raised her arm slowly and turned it in the light. The new luminescence was nothing like the original. It was not the pure, even radiance that healthy Velhari skin produced, that seamless curtain of color that other species found so mesmerizing. It was uneven, clustered, following the edges and borders of the scars in branching patterns that reminded me of river deltas seen from orbit, or root systems spreading through soil, or the branching paths of lightning frozen in glass. It pulsed with a color I had seen once before, in a maintenance corridor after a coolant breach, when Vera had let her wrappings fall and I had told her what humans call the people who survive. That color between gold and pale amber, the color that had no translation. "What does the color mean?" I asked her. "You said you had not made it in a long time." She was quiet for a moment, watching the faint new light trace along the borders of her deepest scars, pulsing gently in time, with something I could not hear, but she could feel. When she spoke, her voice was the steadiest I had ever heard it. No tremor, no hesitation. The voice of someone who has walked through the dark for so long that the first glimmer of dawn feels less like hope and more like proof of a truth they had forgotten they believed. "It does not have a precise word in Galactic Common," she said. "Among my people, among the old stories that were told before the Syndicate, before the harvesting, Before any of this, there were legends about the Velhari who survived the deep trenches of Velhar Prime. The places in the ocean where the water was so deep, and so dark, and so cold, that all light should have been impossible. Nothing should have been able to glow in those depths. The pressure alone should have crushed any bioluminescent capacity, but the stories said that some Velhari learned to shine differently in the deepest dark, not with the light they were born with. That light could not survive the trench, but with a new light, one that the darkness had never encountered before, and therefore could not extinguish, because it had not existed until the darkness made it necessary. She looked up at me, and she smiled. Not the guarded, tentative expression I had seen in our early weeks together. A full smile, open and undefended, and her light answered it. The new light, the impossible light, pulsed along every scar on her body, like a message written in a language the galaxy was only beginning to learn how to read. "You told me you did nothing," she said. "You told Hannah that you simply did not look away, but that is not what happened. I spent 7 years in a galaxy that told me my light was gone forever, that I was empty, that the parts of me that mattered had been cut out and sold and could never grow back. Every species I encountered confirmed it. My own people confirmed it, and I believed them. I believed them because when everyone agrees that you are nothing, it becomes very difficult to remember that you were ever something." She paused. The new light along her scars brightened fractionally, the way a voice strengthens when the speaker finds the truth they have been circling. "And then you looked at me," she said, "on a cargo bay floor, after a falling crate, covered in dust and breathing hard, and not even knowing my name. And you did not see what was missing. You saw what was still there. You saw me. And that is when the new light started, Declan. Not because you gave it to me, because you made me remember it was possible." I stood in that medical bay with my hands in my pockets, and a feeling in my throat that I could not swallow past and did not want to. I thought about 19 humans on a frontier station, who had formed a wall around a stranger without being asked or thanked. I thought about a species that had spent its entire history on a single planet, flawed and violent and broken in 1,000 ways, but carrying within its flawed and violent heart a stubborn, irrational insistence that every single person matters, that suffering is never acceptable, that the measure of what you are is not what you keep, but what you refuse to let go of. I thought about the syndicate and its paperwork, the Commerce Accord and its jurisdictional frameworks, the centuries of law and commerce and cultural consensus that had been engineered to make people like Vera invisible, to categorize them as product, and process them through systems designed to ensure that no one ever had to look at what was being done and feel responsible. And I thought about how all of it, every gear and lever and legal brief and corporate subsidiary, had been stopped by the simplest force in the universe. Someone looked, someone saw, someone refused to walk away. The galaxy had wanted Vera to stay in the dark. Humanity refused to let it happen. And in the space that refusal created, in the shelter of that stubborn, irrational, magnificently human insistence that personhood is not a legal classification, but an unalienable truth, she had found something the darkness could not touch. Not the light she was born with. The syndicate had taken that, and it was never coming back. But something new, something earned, something that traced the borders of every scar on her body like living proof that survival is its own kind of luminescence, that the deepest dark only serves to make the new light brighter, and that a single person who refuses to look away can change the equation for everyone. She glowed, unevenly, imperfectly, beautifully, stubbornly alive, and she never hid again.